Victoria Sterling stood at my pool's edge with a court order in her manicured hands, her Chanel suit reflecting in the water as she delivered what she thought was the killing blow. Mr. Blackwood, you have 72 hours to completely remove this pool or face immediate legal action from the HOA. The structure violates community safety standards and must be demolished. I looked up from my laptop where I'd been reviewing some very interesting financial documents and smiled. Mrs. Sterling, before you force me to remove anything, you might want to check your own books. The FBI certainly has. Her face went white as she realized that demanding a forensic accountant remove his pool might not have been her brightest idea, especially when that accountant had been quietly documenting her embezzlement scheme for the past 6 months. I'm sure many of you have encountered people who use their small amount of power to bully others, thinking their authority makes them untouchable. Maybe you've seen someone abuse their position to intimidate neighbors or manipulate situations for personal gain. Share your experiences with power-hungry officials in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled someone who thought their title gave them the right to control your life. Because what Victoria Sterling tried to pull on me wasn't just HOA overreach, it was a federal crime disguised as community management. But let me take you back to how this whole mess started. My name is Nathan Blackwood, and I'm a forensic accountant who specializes in uncovering financial fraud for corporate clients and legal firms. For 12 years, I've made my living following money trails, analyzing financial patterns, and exposing people who think they're too clever to get caught. It's the kind of work that teaches you to see through polished presentations and official-sounding language to find the truth hidden in numbers and bank statements. 6 months ago, my wife Rachel and I moved to Willowbrook Gardens with our twin teenagers, Alex and Sophie. The neighborhood looked perfect from the outside: manicured lawns, expensive cars. A kind of place where successful families lived quiet, comfortable lives. The house came with a custom infinity pool that the previous owners had installed for their disabled son's therapy sessions, and that pool would end up being the center of everything that followed. What made this pool unique wasn't just its size or the stunning infinity edge that seemed to blend into the horizon. It was the therapeutic equipment that had been carefully integrated into the design: underwater treadmills that allowed low-impact exercise, resistance jets for strength training, accessibility features, including hydraulic lifts and specially designed steps that had cost the previous family over $100,000 to install. We'd kept everything because Alex has been recovering from a car accident that damaged his left leg 6 months earlier. The collision had shattered his femur and torn ligaments that doctors said might never fully heal without intensive physical therapy. The pool wasn't just recreation for us. It was medical equipment that insurance wouldn't cover. A lifeline that allowed my son to rebuild his strength without putting unbearable stress on his healing bones and joints. Every morning at 6 a.m., I'd watch Alex work through his therapy routine in that pool, the underwater treadmill, allowing him to walk and run in ways that gravity wouldn't permit on land. The progress was slow but steady, and after months of seeing him struggle with basic movement, watching him regain his confidence in the water felt like witnessing a miracle. But miracles, as I was about to learn, I don't always sit well with people who see opportunity in other people's vulnerabilities. Victoria Sterling had been Willowbrook Gardens HOA president for 8 years, ever since her husband's construction company went bankrupt and they'd lost their estate in the hills. The bankruptcy had been messy, involving federal fraud charges that her husband barely avoided through plea agreements and asset forfeiture. Victoria was old money that had become no money, but she'd maintained her image through careful social positioning and what she called strategic community leadership. What I didn't know during those first peaceful weeks in our new home was that Victoria's leadership strategy involved systematic financial theft disguised as community management. She'd turned the HOA presidency into a personal profit center, using her authority to create problems that only her expensive solutions could solve. Victoria appeared at my back gate exactly 2 weeks after we moved in, wearing what looked like a $1,000 outfit and carrying a leather portfolio that screamed serious business. Her silver hair was styled in a way that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, and her jewelry caught the morning sunlight like advertising for wealth she no longer actually possessed. Mr. Blackwood, we need to discuss your pool situation. The therapeutic equipment creates liability issues that affect our community insurance rates and property values. I looked at her carefully, noting the expensive clothes, the professional presentation, In the way she positioned herself, like someone used to getting her way through intimidation rather than collaboration. My forensic training had taught me to pay attention to these details. People who dress expensively while claiming financial concerns often have interesting stories to tell. I wasn't aware there were any issues with the pool. Mrs. Sterling. Everything was professionally installed and meets all safety codes. Her smile was sharp as polished steel. City codes are one thing. Mr. Blackwood. Community standards are another matter entirely. According to Victoria, my pool's therapeutic equipment violated multiple HOA regulations that I'd somehow missed during our move-in process. The underwater treadmills were commercial equipment inappropriate for residential use. The accessibility features were modifications requiring architectural approval that was never obtained. Even the pool's depth was somehow non-compliant with safety standards that protect our community's children. But what caught my forensic accountant's attention wasn't the complaints themselves. It was the level of detailed knowledge Victoria displayed about equipment specifications and installation costs that weren't public. Information. Mr. Blackwood, the board has reviewed your property modifications and determined that all therapeutic equipment must be removed, or the entire pool structure needs to be eliminated to bring your property into compliance with community standards. The demand hit like a physical blow. Remove the equipment that was helping my son walk again? Destroy the pool that represented months of his recovery and hope for full mobility? I studied Victoria's face, looking for any sign of empathy or understanding, but found only cold calculation. Mrs. Sterling, this equipment is medical therapy for my son's recovery from a serious accident. Surely the HOA can make accommodations for medical necessity. Medical necessity doesn't override community liability. Mr. Blackwood, your personal situation, while unfortunate, cannot be allowed to compromise the safety and property values of our entire neighborhood. The clinical coldness in her voice made something click in my investigative mind. This wasn't about safety or property values. It was about something else entirely. People don't typically spend weeks researching their neighbor's medical equipment unless they have ulterior motives. When I questioned the specific regulations Victoria cited, she produced official-looking documents with charts showing insurance liability increases and property value impacts that seemed surprisingly detailed for a neighborhood dispute. Her presentation included financial projections, cost-benefit analyses, and risk assessments that looked more like corporate consulting work than HOA management. For someone supposedly concerned about community costs, she'd clearly invested significant money in professional analysis. The documents were printed on expensive paper, bound in professional folders, and contained financial modeling that would have cost thousands of dollars to produce. Either Victoria had access to resources that seemed inconsistent with her husband's bankruptcy, or someone was funding this level of professional presentation for reasons that weren't immediately obvious. These assessments show that your pool modifications increase our community insurance premiums by an estimated 15% annually, Victoria explained, pointing to charts that looked convincing to anyone who didn't understand financial analysis. That cost gets passed on to every homeowner in Willowbrook Gardens. But I did understand financial analysis. And Victoria's numbers were creative fiction. Insurance calculations don't work the way her charts suggested. And the data points she'd used came from commercial properties rather than residential pools. Her financial projections used market conditions from different states entirely, and her risk assessments referenced regulations that didn't exist. More importantly, her detailed knowledge of my pool's exact equipment costs and installation specifications raised serious questions. Information that wasn't public record. Details that could only have come from someone with access to private financial documents or communication with contractors who'd worked on the property. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and walking into that community center felt like entering a corporate boardroom takeover. Victoria had hired a lawyer, prepared professional presentations, and somehow convinced the entire board that my son's therapy pool was an existential threat to property values throughout Willowbrook Gardens. Mr. Blackwood's pool modifications represent an unacceptable liability exposure requiring immediate remediation, Victoria announced to the assembled board members, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making expensive decisions. The board votes to impose daily fines of $500 until compliance is achieved, $500 per day. That meant if I didn't destroy my son's medical therapy equipment within a week, the fines would exceed our monthly mortgage payment. If the process dragged on for a month, we'd be looking at $15,000 in penalties for refusing to eliminate equipment that was helping Alex walk again. As I sat there listening to Victoria's financial arguments and legal threats, my forensic training started flagging inconsistencies that went far beyond simple mathematical errors. Her insurance cost calculations used data from commercial properties rather than residential pools. Her property value analysis referenced market conditions from states we'd never lived in. Her liability assessment cited regulations that didn't exist and legal precedents that had never been set. But what really caught my attention was her detailed knowledge of installation costs and equipment specifications that weren't public information. She knew exactly how much the underwater treadmill had cost, which company had installed the accessibility features, and even details about the electrical work that had been required for the resistance jets. That level of detailed knowledge about private financial information isn't something you acquire through casual neighborhood observation. It requires either access to confidential documents or communication with people who shouldn't be sharing private client information. Walking out of that hearing, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of just fighting Victoria's bogus fines and fabricated regulations, I was going to do what I do best, follow the money and see where it led. That night, I did what I always do when someone's financial claims don't add up. I started digging into the numbers. HOA financial records are public information. And what I found in Willowbrook Gardens books would have gotten any corporate CFO arrested within 24 hours. Victoria's HOA management showed patterns that forensic accountants call classic embezzlement indicators, the kind of financial irregularities that immediately trigger federal investigations when they appear in corporate environments. Consulting fees paid to companies that existed only on paper. Insurance premiums 50% higher than comparable communities. Maintenance contracts with vendors that had the same mailing address as Victoria's personal residence. But the smoking gun was hidden in the assessment records, buried in language that made fraud look like legitimate community management. Victoria had been systematically targeting homeowners with expensive property modifications, forcing them to pay for compliance consultations that went directly into accounts she controlled. My pool wasn't Victoria's first target. It was just her latest victim in a scheme that had been running for over 2 years. The Martinez family had been forced to pay $8,000 for deck compliance modifications that were never actually performed. The Chen family had paid $12,000 for landscape architecture assessments that consisted of a single-page report recommending no changes. Each time, Victoria used official-sounding language and fake legal authority to extract money for services that were never actually provided. She'd created a system where homeowners paid thousands of dollars to avoid problems that didn't exist, using HOA authority to legitimize what was essentially an extortion scheme. But Victoria had made one critical mistake. She'd targeted a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering exactly the type of fraud she'd been committing. And now that I understood what she was really doing, it was time to build the case that would bring down her entire operation. 12 years of forensic accounting had given me contacts in every major financial crimes division in the country. And what I'd discovered about Victoria's operation went far beyond simple HOA corruption. When I called Agent Lisa Crawford at the FBI's white-collar crime unit the next morning, I wasn't just reporting a neighborhood dispute. I was reporting federal fraud that potentially crossed state lines. Nathan, this sounds exactly like the HOA schemes we've been tracking across 3 states. Agent Crawford said after I'd outlined Victoria's financial patterns, "Send me everything you have. If this connects to what we think it does, you've just broken open a major case we've been working on for 18 months. Agent Crawford's reaction confirmed what my forensic analysis had suggested. Victoria's operation was too sophisticated and too well-funded to be a solo effort. The professional presentations, the expensive legal consultations, the detailed financial modeling, someone was backing her activities with resources that went far beyond what a bankrupt former construction executive's wife should have been able to access. Within 48 hours, Agent Crawford arrived at my house with a case file that made Victoria's local fraud look like practice for something much bigger. The FBI had been tracking a network of HOA fraud schemes across North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, all using identical fake documents, similar financial extraction methods, and the same systematic targeting of wealthy homeowners with expensive property modifications. Nathan, we've been looking for the financial architect behind this network for over a year, Agent Crawford explained as she spread photographs and documents across my dining room table. Victoria Sterling might be the key to bringing down a multi-million-dollar fraud operation that's victimized hundreds of families. The evidence was overwhelming. The same fake consulting companies that Victoria used in Willowbrook Gardens had been operating in upscale communities from Charlotte to Jacksonville. The same fraudulent compliance schemes that she'd used against my family were being deployed against homeowners with swimming pools, Dana's Quartz, elaborate landscaping, and expensive home additions across the Southeast. But what made the federal case particularly strong was the coordination between different HOA presidents in different states, email communications, financial transfers, and identical legal documents proved that Victoria wasn't just running a local scam, which she was part of an organized criminal enterprise that specialized in exploiting homeowner associations for systematic financial theft. We need your help. Nathan, Agent Crawford said, your forensic background makes you the perfect inside observer. We want you to continue documenting Victoria's activities while we build the federal case. Keep acting like a concerned homeowner fighting HOA overreach. But document everything she does for prosecution. The idea of working undercover against Victoria while she continued trying to extort money from my family felt like justice in its purest form. Instead of just defending against her attacks, I'd be gathering evidence that could destroy her entire criminal network while protecting other families from the same systematic exploitation. Over the next 2 weeks, with FBI guidance, I started asking Victoria exactly the right questions to make her reveal the full scope of her operation. Instead of just paying her bogus fines or accepting her fraudulent demands, I requested detailed documentation of every fee, every regulation, every financial justification she claimed supported her authority. Victoria, confident in her fake authority and convinced that I was just another frustrated homeowner who would eventually cave to her pressure, provided everything the FBI needed for federal charges: fraudulent invoices for services never rendered, fake legal citations that referenced non-existent regulations, documented threats based on fabricated authority, and evidence of systematic financial exploitation disguised as community management. Mr. Blackwood, your continued resistance is affecting the entire community, Victoria said during what would be our final face-to-face confrontation. The board has voted to escalate this matter to legal action that will result in liens against your property and potential forced sale to cover compliance costs. But her threats had evolved beyond simple fraud into something that caught the FBI's immediate attention. Victoria was now claiming authority to place liens on property and force sales based on violations that didn't exist. Activities that crossed multiple federal crime thresholds, including mail fraud, Wirefraud, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. The fake court order she presented that Tuesday morning was the evidence that Agent Crawford had been waiting for. Instead of just demanding pool modifications or imposing fraudulent fines, Victoria had escalated to complete fabrication of legal documents, claiming governmental authority she didn't possess, standing at my pool with that manufactured court order, threatening legal action based on documents that didn't exist from courts that had never heard her case. Victoria had crossed from fraud into criminal conspiracy, a federal felony that could result in decades in prison. Mrs. Sterling, before you force me to remove anything, you might want to check your own books. The FBI certainly has. The court order fell from her hands into the pool as she realized that her newest victim was actually the forensic accountant who'd been building the federal case against her for months. The confidence drained from her face as completely as if someone had pulled a plug, replaced by the kind of terror that comes from suddenly understanding that your criminal activities have attracted federal attention. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, but her voice carried none of the authority she'd wielded during months of harassment. That's a legitimate court order from the county judicial system. Victoria, I've spent 12 years investigating financial fraud. The court seal on your document doesn't exist. The judge's signature is forged, and the legal citations reference statutes that were repealed 15 years ago. But don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to explain all of this to federal prosecutors. 24 hours later, federal agents executed search warrants on Victoria's house, her fake consulting businesses, and every financial account connected to her fraud network. The simultaneous raids were coordinated across 4 states, targeting every member of the criminal organization that Victoria had helped build and manage. The evidence collected filled an entire FBI van, fake legal documents with forged governmental seals, fraudulent financial records showing money laundering across state lines, correspondence with co-conspirators detailing targeting strategies for wealthy homeowners, and detailed victim lists with instructions for exploiting families with expensive property modifications. But perhaps most damaging were the training materials Victoria had developed for other members of the network, step-by-step guides for identifying vulnerable targets, template documents for creating fake legal authority, and financial modeling tools for maximizing extraction from each victim family. Victoria's arrest triggered a federal investigation that reached from the mountains of North Carolina to the beaches of Florida. Her HOA fraud scheme was just one piece of a criminal organization that had stolen over $2 million from homeowners across the Southeast. Using systematic exploitation disguised as community management, 12 other HOA presidents were arrested in coordinated morning raids, all using identical fake documents and financial schemes that Victoria had helped develop and refine. The network had been operating for 3 years, targeting upscale communities where wealthy homeowners were most likely to have expensive property modifications that could be used as leverage for fraudulent fees. Agent Crawford's investigation revealed the sophisticated recruitment process Victoria's network used to identify new territories. They specifically targeted communities where recent bankruptcies or foreclosures had created financial instability, making residents more vulnerable to authority-based intimidation. The network maintained detailed databases of property values, recent renovations, and homeowner demographics, essentially treating community exploitation like a business operation with market research, territory assignments, and performance metrics for extracting maximum money from each targeted neighborhood. The federal trial revealed the full scope of what Agent Crawford called one of the most sophisticated HOA fraud networks we've ever prosecuted. Elderly homeowners who'd paid tens of thousands for fake compliance violations they never understood. Families forced to sell their homes because of fraudulent liens based on regulations that didn't exist. Entire communities bankrupted by embezzlement disguised as insurance premiums and maintenance fees. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, 83 years old, and suffering from early dementia, had paid Victoria nearly $12,000 for architectural compliance modifications that consisted of nothing more than a single email suggesting she plant different flowers. The Rodriguez family had been forced into bankruptcy by fraudulent legal fees after Victoria claimed their swimming pool violated federal environmental regulations that existed only in her imagination. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the testimony of retired Marine veteran James Murphy, who'd lost his adapted home after Victoria convinced him that his wheelchair accessibility ramp violated neighborhood aesthetic standards. Murphy had spent his disability benefits on bogus compliance modifications, ultimately losing the home he'd specially designed for his mobility needs. His testimony, delivered from his wheelchair with military precision, brought federal prosecutors to tears and added elder abuse charges that increased Victoria's potential sentence by decades. Each victim testimony represented families destroyed by systematic financial predation, but they also represented evidence in a federal case that would ensure Victoria and her criminal network faced serious consequences for their crimes. The breakthrough moment came when federal prosecutors connected Victoria's network to organized crime families operating similar schemes across the eastern United States. The fraud wasn't just local corruption. It was part of a national criminal enterprise that specialized in exploiting homeowner associations because of their quasi-governmental authority and limited oversight. Mrs. Sterling, you've been convicted on federal charges, including mail fraud, Wirefraud, conspiracy to commit racketeering, and elder abuse, the federal judge announced during sentencing. The court sentences you to 8 years in federal prison and orders complete restitution to all victims. 8 years in federal prison, complete asset forfeiture to compensate every family she'd victimized, permanent prohibition from holding any position of authority in community organizations. The fake court order demanding my pool removal had become Exhibit A in a federal case that destroyed an entire criminal network. But the real victory wasn't just Victoria's conviction. It was the restoration of communities that had been systematically exploited for years. The FBI's asset forfeiture program allowed complete restitution to every family Victoria and her network had victimized. The Martinez family received their $8,000 back with interest and additional damages for emotional distress. The Chen family got their $12,000 plus compensation for the fraudulent landscaping modifications they'd been forced to accept. Mrs. Patterson received full restitution for the bogus architectural fees, plus additional support services to help elderly victims recover from financial exploitation. The Rodriguez family got enough compensation to rebuild their credit and purchase a new home after losing everything to Victoria's fraudulent legal claims. Willowbrook Gardens elected a new HOA board focused on actual community service rather than personal profit schemes. The new president, retired teacher Margaret Wilson, implemented financial oversight procedures that would prevent future fraud while actually improving community amenities and property values through legitimate management. But the most important victory was personal. 6 months after Victoria's conviction, Alex had fully recovered from his accident and was walking without any assistance for the first time since the collision. The therapeutic pool that Victoria had tried to force us to remove had been the key to his complete recovery, allowing him to rebuild strength and mobility that doctors had said might never return. Sophie made varsity swim team using our home training facility, and her morning practice sessions had become neighborhood gathering points where kids from across Willowbrook Gardens came to swim and play in the pool that had survived federal criminal prosecution. Rachel now hosts monthly community gatherings around the pool where neighbors actually support each other instead of exploiting vulnerabilities for personal profit. The infinity edge that Victoria had called a community liability now reflects laughter and friendship instead of fear and intimidation. The underwater treadmill where Alex rebuilt his strength has been used by 3 other neighborhood children recovering from sports injuries, and the accessibility features that Victoria claimed violated community standards have helped elderly residents maintain independence and mobility that improves their quality of life. Most evenings, I'll sit by the pool and watch families enjoying the space that Victoria tried to destroy, knowing that federal prosecution protected not just our property rights but the rights of hundreds of families across multiple states. Alex practices his diving technique in the same water where Victoria's fake court order fell when she realized her criminal network had been exposed. The case taught me that forensic accounting skills developed in corporate environments can be just as valuable in protecting communities from financial predators who use official titles to disguise criminal behavior. Victoria Sterling thought she was targeting a helpless homeowner who would pay fraudulent fees rather than fight back against fake authority. Instead, she targeted a professional fraud investigator who understood exactly how to document her crimes and connect them to federal prosecution resources. The systematic financial exploitation that she thought was invisible became the evidence that destroyed her entire criminal organization. 12 years of following money trails and exposing white-collar criminals had prepared me for corporate fraud. But I'd never imagined using those skills to protect my own family and community from organized crime disguised as neighborhood management. Victoria's attempt to steal money through fake HOA authority became the federal case that exposed a multi-million-dollar criminal network. Sometimes the best way to deal with financial bullies isn't to pay their fake fees or accept their fraudulent authority. Sometimes it's to document their crimes, connect with federal law enforcement, and let professional prosecutors show them what real legal consequences look like. Victoria learned that lesson during 8 years in federal prison. While hundreds of families learned that communities work best when real oversight protects them from predators who exploit trust and official positions for criminal profit, the pool she demanded be removed became the center of a neighborhood restored from systematic financial exploitation to genuine community cooperation. The therapeutic equipment that she claimed violated community standards is still helping people recover from injuries and maintain health that improves their lives. The accessibility features that she said threatened property values have enabled elderly residents to remain independent in their own homes rather than being forced into institutional care. Federal justice prevailed over neighborhood fraud. Criminal networks were destroyed by professional investigation, and families learned that sometimes the most important community service is protecting each other from people who would exploit vulnerability for personal gain. The infinity pool still reflects the horizon, but now it also reflects the kind of community that emerges when criminal predators are removed and genuine neighbors are free to support each other's success, rather than fear exploitation disguised as authority. Last month, we celebrated the 2nd anniversary of Victoria's conviction with a neighborhood barbecue attended by over 60 families, including several from other communities who'd been inspired by our story to investigate their own HOA irregularities. 3 additional fraud networks have been exposed using the investigative model we developed, protecting hundreds more families from the systematic exploitation that Victoria's organization had perfected.